Mr. Chairman, let me begin with you simply to provide a frame for what we're talking about today. There are a lot of people, and I count myself among them, who thought we sent legislators to the Capitol to do the heavy lifting for us, to make the hard decisions on our behalf. On other issues, public education, higher education, you spend the money on our behalf because we send you there to do that. And then you come back and explain why you did it. And our referendum is on you at election time. This time, the legislature on both water and transportation, water this year, transportation next year, has said we don't trust ourselves enough to make that decision, or so it appears. We're going to ask the voters to make the decision on their own behalf. Why is that, and why should you be asking us to get in here on this issue?
Well, that's a fair question, and generally I agree with you that our job as elected officials is to make the decisions, the hard decisions when they're hard decisions, and be accountable to our constituents. This was a little bit unique situation. One, you had many members of the legislature that have been elected that absolutely we're not going to raise taxes, we're not going to raise fees, we're not going to do this, we're not going to do that, and has been that way for quite a few sessions.
These are the so-called no birds. That's how they describe themselves.
No birds?
The no birds.
Well, you said it, I didn't.
Yeah.
I haven't heard no birds.
Yeah.
But, and as you know, since 1997, when the legislature actually passed Senate Bill 1, which is the foundation of the state water plan, the legislature has been trying to find a method to fund the state water plan, a dedicated source, and we have not been able to accomplish it because it took a tax, a fee, some basis like this, and the legislature has been reluctant to do it, and it has not been that high a priority, and we have not had any droughts to 2010, basically.
Well, we made up for lost time.
We made up for lost time in the droughts drastically.
Yeah.
We had a pretty good going battle between the House and the Senate as to doing it constitutionally, not constitutionally. We're taking it to the voters. The one thing that was important to members of the House, mostly the House Natural Resources Committee and the Speaker, were how do we develop checks and balance systems in the program?
Yep.
How do we protect the corpus of the fund, in this case, the infrastructure bank, or the $2 billion that is going to be, that's in SWIFT, how do we protect that in its investment? Well, one thing we wanted to do, if you would go back and you'd see in the original bill, House Bill 4, we were taking the SWIFT and SWERF, actually putting it outside of Treasury. And the reason for that was so that the legislature couldn't mess with it.
And SWIFT, for the benefit of people in the audience, SWIFT is the State Water Implementation Fund of Texas. This is the fund that would be created, voters bless it.
That's right.
$2 billion goes into that fund, and it is a revolving loan fund.
Well, that is the corpus of the $2 billion, and then SWERF has to work through that to make it revolving. Well, anyway, trying to make sure we had these checks and balance systems, and you might recall also a problem we had with the Cancer Research Institute where there were questions about how money was being used. Well, we had a concern that in our checks and balances, were we going to have an entity that could stop it? If there were red flags, if our advisory committee or the board of the Water Development Board or Safekeeping Trust or members of the legislature said, well, we've got a concern either because of the economic times or whatever that we don't want to do this right now. So in the constitutional amendment, and this is one of the things that really sold me on this is the direction we need to go on this, in the constitutional amendment, we actually constitutionally dedicate those two funds. That means that that money can only be used for that.
Can't be diverted.
Legislature can't do anything with it other than what the Constitution says. The other thing is, in our checks and balances, we put in that amendment that the Legislative Budget Board has the authority to disapprove those loans. Now you'll ask them, well, why in the world would you do that? Because we needed to measure, having learned from the Cancer Research Institute and the way it operates, we needed to measure that if the legislature or the Legislative Budget Board, the governor, the lieutenant governor, the speaker, and those members and members of the legislature got concerned for whatever reason and needed to hold it up, the only mechanism we could find constitutionally to do that would be to put this in that constitutional amendment, and it is in there. So that's part of our checks and balance system, and that's how
that's what will go before the voters.
Right.
Now, Laura, the chairman referred to the drought.
Right.
It is the worst one-year drought in the history of Texas. Much of the state is back up to drought conditions now. I guess we should assume we all agree that the need for this plan is ever more urgent. From your perspective?
Absolutely. I don't think there's a person living in Texas that hasn't had some personal experience with the drought in the last several years. As a state, our economy has certainly taken a hit, and I think the timing of this election is perfect for Texas. And when we look for checks and balances, in addition to the ones that the chairman mentioned, we're looking for checks and balances on the policy side as well.
Yeah.
And one of the things that we really like about the package of bills that was passed this last session is that it's not just money. In addition to funding the state water plan, the legislature did some things that will guarantee things that are important to our organization. There's a 20% set aside, for example, for conservation and reuse projects. There's an additional set aside for agricultural conservation and rural projects to make sure that rural projects don't get left out of the mix. There's some excellent policy in there that will require, both at the regional level and at the state level, some prioritization of this state water plan, because the fair criticism of the plan right now is that it's a laundry list of projects and it's hard to know what the good ones are and which ones should be funded first, and the legislation fixes that. And of course, we all know what we're up against. The state, including the city and the county that we're in, are growing extraordinarily rapidly. The last drought in Texas, there were only fewer than 10 million of us that had to figure out a way to recover from the drought. We're living in a state that has 25 million people. That's a lot of straws in the water, and it's harder to crawl out of a drought. And so we think the combination of the policy and the timing is perfect, and we think it's a case that's hard to miss for Texas.
But of course, Laura, you say, there aren't people in the state who have not interacted with the drought in some way. The counter to that is people all over the state, big cities and most small towns, they go home at the end of the day, they turn on the tap in their kitchen sink and water comes out. Or on the appointed day, they turn on their sprinkler and water comes out. Or their swimming pools are full. I mean, it would be possible as an individual to think, well, there can't be that much of a crisis because I'm getting water out of the things that normally give me water. So do we have a sales job? I mean, what you're saying is certainly correct at the top line, but you got to get people to the polls, and the crisis is the motivator. So how do you persuade people in their lives that this crisis is real?
No question, we have a sales job, and that job is not going to come to an end anytime soon because we live in a state that really hasn't had to ratchet back water use. We're just now at a point where major Texas cities as a whole have water conservation measures at the local level that actually regulate how often people can use water. And so we've had the luxury of being able to balance a very strong agricultural community with growing Texas cities, with a wonderful array of rivers and streams and lakes and aquifers that are relatively healthy, with a growing energy and industry sector. But we are now at a point, we're at a fork in the road, and we're at a point where we will not be able to maintain that balance unless we really do things differently. And I think it's a combination of planning future water supplies and then just fundamentally changing behavior as it relates to water. And that doesn't just fall on cities. There's a responsibility in the agricultural sector. There's a responsibility in the energy and industry sector. And of course, we don't want to leave out our rivers and streams. They're the future for this state.
Chairman, when you and I sat at the Austin Club at the very beginning of the session, when this issue was finally beginning to be visible to people, the number was not yet set. You said you thought it was $2 billion. I think
good guess, wasn't it?
Saying it was good guesswork. Whatever it was guesswork, it was extremely good guesswork. Lieutenant Governor Dewhurst was talking about $1.5 billion, or some folks in the House were even talking about $1 billion. You said no, it needs to be $2 billion. Of course, the water plan is, as written, a 50-year plan, and it's a $53 billion price tag. Now, $2 billion of $53 billion doesn't seem like much. So why should we feel confident that a $2 billion expenditure against a $53 billion plan is adequate to the task?
Evan, we throw around a lot of numbers,
Yeah.
and the state water plan is our roadmap to the future. It's
Yeah.
very simple. The $53 billion we're talking about is the total capital cost requirement for all the infrastructure in the water plan. Some 600, give or take, I don't remember exactly how many projects, $53 billion. In the state water plan, the whole basis for the state water plan is for all of us to come together and determine what our needs are, where we're short, what our needs are going to be, and how are we going to get there. And one of the things that we ask, SB1 asked the local entities and the regions is, what kind of help do you need getting there? We call it getting over the hump.
Yeah.
The participation part that is requested from local entities related to the $53 billion is $27 billion. That is what they're asking. The local entities are asking the state to help them to get these projects done. So, and there were probably at least 350 different modeling avenues that are worked on to develop the number. The reason why I came up with the $2 billion, if you remember in 2011, we rolled out a bill out of natural resources where we were talking about taking $350 million out of one fund as seed capital to tie in and participation with the general bonding. And so we knew we could extrapolate depending on the four corners of the water plan and how much seed capital you got, or the other way. So the numbers are there. Is it subject to change? Yes. This is an ongoing, perpetual plan that every 5 years is updated. Would it be a prayer answered that the next time we do one or in the one after that, that technology has changed enough where we are now doing infrastructure totally different at half the cost?
Right, the cost could come down. The fact that it's a 50-year plan, it leaves time.
But you can't, I can't plan on that. We can't plan on that. We have to do our bases on the four corners of the state water plan, which is $53 billion.
And so we're clear on this, Mr. Chairman. The state water plan is really not one plan. It's 16 different authorities, water authorities, right?
It's 16 different regional groups working with local entities.
And they're feeding essentially their visions
it's
upstream.
Bottom up.
It's bottom up.
Let me make a comment
I wish
about
you would.
that. I mean, a really important part of this funding. So the point here is that part of the funding is intended to come from the state, and you've got cities and utilities telling the state, we're counting on you for some of this money. The other part of the funding is going to happen very locally. I think that's the perfect arrangement for water as we sit in Texas today. It is both a local and a statewide issue, and we're not going to move out of that space anytime soon. Houston is actually a perfect example. Not only does Houston have to find future water supplies in order to support its doubling in size over the next several decades, but Houston will also benefit from or suffer from water planning in Dallas, for example, which is going to send whatever comes down the Trinity River is coming to Houston. Water planning in Central Texas will impact the inflows to the bays and estuaries. So we are sitting in a community that will inherit either the good or the bad planning that happens in the rest of the state.
And just as you say that everything these days is going to be public and private, I mean, state and local, everything is also going to be public and private, right?
That's
This
exactly
is not
right.
simply going to be a responsibility borne by the public side of things. Private entities are going to get into partnerships with state and local entities to make all this happen. Because that's
could happen.
The only way things happen these days. Laura, you talked about the conservation policies that are baked into this cake. This is not simply about new sources of water, but it's about treating existing sources of water better so that more of those sources and more of that water remains available to us.
That's exactly right, and I'll give you a couple of examples how that looks. So anything that we can do to get the efficient use of existing water is in the best interest of every sector of water. That's in the best interest of cities, that's in the best interest of ag, energy, and industry, and it is certainly in the best interest of our rivers and streams and aquifers. So let me just give you an example of how this will look prospectively. We will simply start thinking differently about water. There are parts of Texas, South Texas, for example, where you've got strong agricultural use of water and you've got a growing city, Brownsville. You can see a situation in which Brownsville might take an interest in lining channels that deliver that water to the agricultural interest, which will dramatically reduce ag's need for water, and the city can buy that water as its future water supply. What have you done? You've not added any net new water to the system, but you've increased the efficiency of the water that is currently being used. And this is why we think it's so important that everybody has to get interested in solving everyone else's problems. Cities have to get interested in agriculture. Agriculture has to get interested in in-stream. In-stream has to be interested in energy and industry, because it's the plays between those uses that will allow us to squeeze efficiencies out of these existing supplies, so that when cities or whoever is seeking new supplies out of the state funding, you know they need those supplies.
And that also goes to a point that I've heard Andy Sansom, we all know Andy Sansom at Texas State, who's quite expert on this subject, say that in a lot of counties, the storage facilities, the pipes and the water tanks are old and in need of repair or need of replacement. And just through leakage, you end up losing a lot of the existing water. So hopefully one aspect of this will be to allow local authorities to refurbish their storage facilities, which will have a conservation aspect of its own.
Well, in fact, the chairman put in his legislation language that allows the state, so as Texas Water Development Board crafts its lending programs, there's language that the chairman added that would allow the agency to recognize those cities that have low water losses and low per capita water use, which are the two big indicators you would use to determine everything that can be done is being done to efficiently use water, and somehow reward those cities with lower interest rates, longer favorable terms.
So good behavior, Mr. Chairman, brings rewards.
You know, we're trying to give flexibility to the Water Development Board, to the process, because can anybody in here tell me what's going to be like in 5 years? No, you can't. So we don't want to hamstring an agency by legislation that only works right now and not in 5 years, and not be able to be flexible enough to develop processes, programs that will work at the time they need to do it. That's very important, because we're only going to be as successful as our ability to plan and execute these projects.
Now, this idea of technology coming online, you both alluded to this, and Chairman, you said we don't know what it's going to look like in a few years. Technology may bring the cost down. There's one theory about the state water plan, that it's the wrong plan. Just in the main, it's the wrong plan. It's a plan that assumes we can engineer our way out of the problem, when in fact we need to be putting an emphasis not on reservoirs and piping water from places that have it to places that need it, but things like desal, reuse, that maybe when the water plan was written, it was the best and most forward-thinking plan, but that maybe we actually need to sit down, blow the thing up, and start over at the state level. What do you think about that?
I think that each regional group, each local entity, City of Houston, I believe, has someone here today. I think as time goes along, they're going to make the changes as to what works for them. You hear a lot about, well, reservoirs don't work. Well, I'm sorry, reservoirs do work. They have worked, they have saved the state of Texas in a lot of different areas. Are they perfect? No, they're not. Are they the best value for new water in some areas? Could be. I can't tell you that in a general assumption. It depends on each location, each program, each project. I think they're going to be tougher and tougher to do. I think they'll probably come of less value down the line as we see desal even get better, mostly to the degree that saltwater desal becomes even more advantageous to us. You hear from a lot of people, well, the rest of the country, they're not doing reservoirs and such. Well, to a degree, that's correct. And yeah, generally, yes, that's correct. But the truth is, most of them don't have the land on the rivers with the ability to do reservoirs. We've got, 26 reservoir sites or something like that, designated reservoir sites in the water plan. We're not going to do 26 of them. I don't believe that. Will we do some of them? We're fixing to do Ralph Hall.
Yeah.
Ralph Hall got approved.
Just got approved last week, right?
Last week. And the cost basis, the ratio for return, it's there.
Right, but Mr. Chairman, you know that, let's speak about Ralph Hall specifically. So there were a lot of people who were for it. Regionally, there was a lot of interest in it because the demand is obviously there, and they thought this is going to be a good thing. But to come to you and then to Laura, there were a lot of environmental concerns raised about Ralph Hall coming online, and I suspect that as we get into the details of the water plan, yeah, the reservoirs may be part of a big solution. They may be the biggest part of a big solution for the state's problems, but you're going to have environmental issues. Right. You're going to have eminent domain issues, property rights issues. People are not going to be particularly eager, even if they need water, to give up the land and the rights necessary to have pipe on their...
And that definitely what makes it more of a disadvantage.
So what do you do about that? And then to Chairman first, and then to Laura on the environmental stuff specifically.
Well, in the planning process, what that tells me, if an area is looking at doing a reservoir and it doesn't come together, they're going to have other options. I don't know of any area that really is just looking at one thing. Most areas are looking at multiple projects, multiple plans, including Houston, Dallas-Fort Worth area. But I believe to do their job on behalf of the citizens of their area, they have to do their due diligence, and to say a reservoir is just out of the question, I can't say that. Yeah. I think you have to look at the project, the program, and make your
So it may be rather than either or, both and.
Yeah,
some kind of a mix of...
I think they become less and less.
Over time.
Over time, yeah, I do.
Are you concerned, Laura, as leading one of the most ecologically concerned organizations in the state, that environmental issues are going to come up on these projects?
Yeah, they absolutely will come up, and those are fair debates, right? So as cities diversify their water supplies in the future, I love the idea of cities testing out a whole variety of options and seeing how they compare in terms of cost and reliability and impact to the environment. Those are things that are going to be important both as local issues and as statewide issues. You know, for me, the governor on all this is that state water plan is updated very routinely. We're in the middle of an update right now. Right. So there is a mechanism for utilities and cities to recognize that changes in their environment and changes in technology, changes in cost. And we tend to focus in on reservoirs, but you got to keep in mind reservoirs are less than 16% of the projected water supply for the state of Texas, while conservation is projected to be more than 25% of the water supply strategy. So I've thought a lot about, your question originally was, is this a build your way out of it strategy? Yeah. I think when 25% of the future water supply of the state of Texas is scheduled to come from conservation, you can't fairly characterize it as strictly a build your way out of it program. When you have required updates every 5 years, I think you can say there are mechanisms in place to recognize a changing world. The last little shoe to drop for me is to make sure that you get a good environmental analysis of projects so that you can, and cost. Yeah. Some of the worst ideas are also, by the way, the most expensive ideas.
Yeah. That's right.
And those are important regulators on what things cities and utilities will move forward with and what they wouldn't. I love that Carlos Rubenstein, the new chair of the commission at the Texas Water Development Board, is wanting to require a full-blown sort of regulatory analysis of projects as they move through so that cities that are having some of the more complicated, controversial ideas are aware at the front end of what it is that they're going to be facing.
Yeah. Speaking of the Water Development Board and the changes, Chairman, the Water Development Board has largely existed under cover of darkness for most people, right? It's a very obscure state. The nice way to say it is it's been an obscure state agency. Yeah. All of a sudden, by virtue of the profile of this issue going up and the changes to the Development Board, all of a sudden, these are the most important people in the public policy realm or among them. We don't know much about them. There were already charges that the governor made appointments of some people who don't really have a background in this, not Chairman Rubenstein, but some of the other commissioners, fairly or unfairly, politics rearing its head in all this. Can you level set our expectations for what for what's coming with the Water Development Board? How should we think about them, and what role will they play?
I got to tell you, I was actually pleased with the appointments.
You were?
Yeah. Commissioner Williamson has been on a commission before. She knows how to operate stuff, and I don't know her personally, but she's a tough lady, and I think that was a good pick. The other gentleman has been involved with water issues, and of course, Carlos is probably the most knowledgeable person in
People
Texas.
assume he will really be the lead on
Well,
this, right?
he is the chairman.
Yeah.
But Evan, they're one part of the chain.
Yeah.
The Water Development Board, the board and their staff, and the board, the Water Development Board has been a very staff-heavy ran operation.
Right.
And most people didn't even know they had 6 commissioners till we brought it up and changed it. But when you look at the whole planning process, SB 1, all the law that we're under, that Water Development Board has got to do their job. They're a key part of that chain, just like the city of Houston and all the local entities, just like the regional planning, and the same thing with the legislature. Yeah. To me, the weakest link in that chain is as good as we're going to get, and I have probably wore the speaker's ears out and the governor's and everybody else's about how important it is for members of the legislature to really be knowledgeable about the Water Development Board and how it works, how we're doing, because it affects every area of this state. Where I live, we normally get 60 inches of rain a year.
Yeah.
One year we only got 24. It woke us up.
Yeah.
But it's affect us. My area in the Jefferson County, Orange County area has to come up with almost 200,000 acre feet of water. And we know we have to. There's really not an area of Texas where this isn't affected, so we need to have a strong, workable board under legislation with the flexibility, but the legislature, the locals, the Water Development Board, and the region planning process have all got to work very close together just to be successful.
Before we go to questions from the audience, I want to ask each of you a practical question about the November ballot initiative. You're both for Prop 6.
Yeah.
Yes.
This is an off-year election. We are famous in Texas for having low voter turnout, and the last time, 2010, the last time that our voter turnout was measured against the other states, we finished dead last, 51st out of 50. The other 49 states in Washington, D.C. had a higher voter turnout than we did. One thing that happens when important issues like this one come up on an off-year election ballot is voter turnout is even lower than it normally is, and the people who are mad tend to turn their people out easier than the people who are happy. And the people who are mad in this case are people who, like the no birds, Chairman, again, my phrase or theirs, not yours, don't want to spend any money on anything. That is a strain of conversation in politics these days. Why should we not be worried that this thing is going to go down? And why are you optimistic that it isn't in an off-year election in which turnout will be low and the activated people will get their guys out, but maybe the happy people won't get theirs?
Well, one reason why I'm here, not only because I really like you.
Well, thank you.
Is because
we'll make sure that got caught on tape.
I want to help spread the message about how important this is, and for all of us citizens of Texas to go vote for this. I've been in the legislature 15 years now. I've never seen anything where you had 160 plus members of the legislature sign on together to work for one goal, to pass this Prop 6.
Right, that's 160 out of 181.
That's right.
Right, that's pretty good.
I've never seen that before. Yeah. Now, I've spent the last 4 years going all over the state of Texas. Joe Strauss is going all over the state of Texas. A lot of those 100 plus members are working diligently to inform the citizens of this great state what this is about. We are networking with different groups. I see the farm bureaus over in the corner. Whether it's Texas Association of Business or Realtors or whatever groups, there's a big networking entity. We're going to do everything we can to get the message out and get people to vote. That's all I know to do.
Now, that's the inside view. The
Yeah.
outside view, or the near outside view, is what? On the likelihood of this passage, and what strategies you employed to get people out?
Well, I actually think this is kind of interesting because I was talking to someone right before we went on. The situation in Texas has gotten so close to the edge that it's actually involving people that we haven't seen before. We're here today because the Meadows Foundation has an interest in this issue and wants to educate Texans on what's going on and why they should care. So you've got the foundations of Texas engaging differently. You've got the nonprofits of Texas engaging differently because we want people to understand what is going on and what's at stake here. The Greater Houston Partnership spent the day yesterday educating the business community on what's going on. I think one of the interesting but beneficial things that's occurring in Texas is that you have non-traditional players engaging in this. It is not just people who are charged with providing water that are engaging. You've got people who have an interest in this from a whole variety of perspectives. So that gives me hope. Yeah. That you've got people that are going to reach into their membership, reach out to the people that are closest to them, and really help frame up the fair conversation. Because the unfair conversation is what happens at the outer edges of this. There's an enormous amount of room for this state to do water planning that would be significant globally. There's nothing happening in Texas. There's no more dramatic condition happening on the planet than what's happening right here in Texas. And we've got a lot of lessons that we can share. And I think there are groups out there working for this. So I'm optimistic. And I'm also especially optimistic because I know that water is one of those issues that Texans in general feel sort of a personal accountability for. This is not one of those complicated problems where people are pointing their fingers at someone else saying, you broke it, you fix it. Water happens to be an issue that people feel some accountability for, and I draw great hope from that.
Okay. Let's take questions from the audience. We've got a microphone we can walk around. If you prefer to just stand up and use your outside voice, that's also okay. Whatever you prefer. Ma'am?
What about the use of gray water to water agriculture, lawns, and also educating Texans to get rid of their lawns and plant something else?
Right, so this would be sort of a two-part question. One is, what about the use of gray water to support this? And then the second thing about lawns, my colleague Ross Ramsey refers to this as the Battle of St. Augustine. You know, Texans want their lawns, and as much as they say not in my backyard, they also say not on my front lawn when it comes to the impetus to preserve water. So how do you deal with these two issues, gray water and the lawn question? What would you say?
The lawn question is a very difficult question because how do you police it? And the level for us on the House Natural Resources Committee is how do we work with local governmental entities to help them do their job. I would imagine there's some places if you'd go and say you're not watering your lawn, you're going to get shot at. I know that there are some places where it is an everyday occurrence and the practice is being done, like San Antonio. It's very common. It really is something that is organized and overseen on the local level. The gray water, a local entity can do that. There's nothing against them doing that now. Now, the definition of gray water and uses and things, now that's a whole nother discussion, but that kind of ties into a lot of what we call reuse. And I will say, Evan, we're hearing now of some really phenomenal things that are being done in the concept of reuse, even to the degree of using fracking water, reusing fracking water, and then turning it over to a city, a municipality. So there's a lot of avenues out there, and you don't close any door. But to answer your question directly, the local entity, if they can find out a way, they can do it.
What about lawns, Laura? What do you say to people when they say, well, wait a minute, I acknowledge that we have a problem, but this is my lawn after all? And
Well, look,
I have to live here.
Right, so
If it ain't there, it ain't
cities all over Texas have already begun regulating outdoor watering, and we know that if we're really going to conserve water and we're going to look at the residential use of water, you absolutely have to look to outdoor lawn watering because that's where most of the water's going in the summer months. And to the reuse question, I say, love reuse. Under the following condition, this cannot and should not be about finding clever new ways to support the same old habits. And by that I mean we can't just find new ways to keep our St. Augustine lawns green. We really are going to have to think about water differently. And to the extent that reuse can be part of that package, I applaud it. To the extent that rainwater collection can be part of that package, I applaud it. But ultimately, we're going to have to start using less water on a per capita basis. We're going to have to use less water to support our energy and industry. We're going to have to use less water to grow food in Texas, and we're going to have to keep a really close eye out on those rivers and streams because without them, there really won't be a future water supply. So you can't do the same old things with new water supplies.
Okay. Sir.
Thanks. Thank you. My name is Michael Bloom, and I'm chair of the Water Committee at the Greater Houston Partnership. And yesterday at our event, Jace Houston with the San Jacinto River Authority informed everyone there about the interest rate and the money that would have been saved under the, assuming Prop 6 was approved and all the new stuff was underway, what the borrowing capacity was and the interest rate. And he was saying, and around numbers, that the project that they're working on, including interest and principal, is about $900 million, and that under the new program, after Prop 6 passes, they would have saved $200 million. And I wanted to just see if the intent of the legislation was actually to create, really that much of a discount in terms of the interest rate, and then also how that actually works in terms of a long-term sustainable revolving fund.
Yeah, I want to be sure people understand exactly how this fund works, Chairman. That might be a good means to discuss that.
The fund works from project by project. The particular project he's talking about, I can't speak about it. He's saying that the overall advantage is $200 million on a $900 million capital cost. First, you got to go dig into it and see, well, in the water plan, what did they ask for? They're asking for $200 million worth of help in this project here, and how are they doing it? Are they actually just lowering rates or what? I don't know. I can't answer that, and only the Water Development Board or that entity could answer, and I assume that's not a done deal either. Correct?
Well, I mean, I guess what he did is he asked his financial advisor to talk directly with the board about the what-if scenario.
Yeah.
And again, the capital dollars were not 900. The capital was about 400, and then the interest rate over 30 years, the total.
Okay. Yeah.
So it was the interest saving.
So that the revolving loan fund created under Prop 6 would have a more favorable interest rate than if they went out to the private market to get that.
No, as compared to existing.
Fair, fine, as compared to existing.
That could be.
Right.
Yeah.
So you're going to basically set up this fund that people are going to apply for funds to be withdrawn, and they'll do their projects, and then they'll pay the fund back,
That's
and then
correct.
other projects will be funded through the same fund, and kind of
Right.
so on
The
and so on and so
investment,
on.
the growth investment in corpus, and the money coming back from SWRF.
Right. And who picks winners and losers in the parlance of politics in this? Who gets to say yay, nay to the projects being approved? That's the Water Development Board.
Board is no elected official.
Right, so in that respect, actually, the reconstituted
That was
Water
about-
Development Board does have a very large role to play in that they're going to be the arbiters of good versus not so good.
Yes, they do. Now in the prioritization, you got to remember that regional planning groups also have a tie into that.
Yep.
There's checks and balance systems that are in the legislation, but also there's going to be checks and balances through prioritization that will be established by the Water Development Board with help from the advisory panel
Right.
of the legislature.
Got it. Ma'am.
I have a quick comment and then the question. My name is Jennifer Lorenz, and I'm the Executive Director of Bayou Land Conservancy here in Houston, and we do conservation easements and we protect watersheds. So I just wanted to share with the group here is that we also have a No Child Left Inside environmental education program, and what we do is we bring thousands of kids out every year to some of the upper watersheds that feed Lake Houston. And I can tell you a sad fact, which is 99.9% of the thousands of students and their teachers who we bring out to talk about how these upper watersheds impact Lake Houston, they don't even know what a watershed is, much less the fact that they're drinking the water that they're standing over the creek on. And so I think that's a huge gap that is different in Texas. As a native Texan, I can say that, who's traveled all over the world.
Yep.
We don't know in Texas, too many of us are not aware of where we get our water in the first place. So I just wanted to share that. Second of all, I did want to ask you a question and also make a comment. The reservoir situation, I think we should not refer to it as new water for a community. I think it's rerouted water. And I think that that's important for us to say because we're not making new water. It's certainly a new source for an area, but those reservoirs and the many that are out there, I think it's very important to understand that there's a lot of those that are planned where conservation easements on public and private landowners' land is placed, and I'm hoping that the legislature will talk to the Water Development Board about the need to continue to allow some of those conservation easements that are in effect all over this great state that are cleaning the water sources like Lake Houston, because that's really important. New York has 0 water quality filter treatments because they bought up all the Adirondacks and left it in its natural state.
I know that Laura and the Nature Conservancy have been all over the conservation easement issue forever, right? This is a big thing that you've done.
Yeah, so let me just give you some context for that comment. By the way, I love the work that you do. It's important. So we've talked a lot about water supply, which is a quantity issue, and that's what the water plan is mostly concerned with. But on the other side of this equation, importantly, is water quality. And actually, Houston would be a city that should be concerned about water quality because you're at the tail end of every pipe in Texas. So we have very established programs in the land trust community that protect water quality by protecting land in key parts of aquifers and in watersheds. And by managing the hydrological function of the land, in other words, letting it function like the sponge it should function as, you can actually have a really positive impact on water quality. Now, why is that important? Because it costs a lot of money to get pollutants out of water. So ultimately, we see cities wanting to invest in water quality protection programs as a mechanism to keep utility bills down. We've done some work here in this Houston area. We're focused on the Brazos River. Others are focused on the Trinity River. And San Antonio has made hundreds of millions of dollars in investments in these kinds of programs. Why? Because they drink water straight out of the Edwards Aquifer, and there's very little filter, so to speak, between the water that comes down and the water that they're pumping up. Just a quick comment about the reservoirs. There's actually no new water, period. And I like to say this every time we talk about water. Water is a completely fixed asset. There is no more or less water on this planet today than there were thousands and thousands of years ago. So ultimately what we're talking about is optimizing its use.
Good. Other questions? Gentleman in the front here. Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Marcelo Moacir. I work for Odebrecht Environmental. We had a discussion yesterday at the GHP seminar. And there are 562 projects within the Texas water plan. And it's going to be a huge task to prioritize those projects and to get them rolled into Proposition 6. We just talked about new technologies that are coming into play. And I'd like to bring another factor. Those water plans are produced in 5-year increments. If you think about the latest one that created the Texas Water Plan in 2012, we're talking about the 2007 to mid-2011 period of time in which the regional water plans were produced. My point is, the most stringent point of our drought of 2011 happened in the middle of the year. So it's possible that the water plans are not capturing the whole breadth of the 2011 drought. And also, we had a lot of new economic development generated by the shale gas phenomenon, with lots of new industries are coming into the towns and a lot of expansions are coming in due to the cheap feedstock. So how do we grab those 562 projects, and some of them might not even be considering new water for the industries? And if you think about the industries are having a much different problem than a homeowner, for example. A homeowner, like you all said, they can cut down the water on the outside and they're still going to live with the water they have inside of their house.
So the idea here is that maybe the plan, when it was written, didn't take into account some of the activities today that may be further straining our water, whether it's industry or the drought, the impact of the drought.
And not only that, how do we pick the projects that might not have been on the Texas Water Plan radar due to the new conditions that just came into play?
Well, the plan gets updated, is that right? You said every...
Yes, it gets updated. In 2011, is the one single year drought of record in Texas now. But it's not the picture of the long-term drought. There's not a river authority, groundwater district, a municipality. There's not, no one I know does not know what the numbers of 2011 and how it affected them. And yes, the water plan has not been redone yet, but do not think they don't know what 2011 in a single year, how it affected all of us. And I'll give you an example. 2011 in southeast Texas in the Neches River Basin, which is fed by Sam Rayburn Reservoir, was losing about 140,000, 170,000 acre feet a month for about 3 months because of evaporation. We normally get about 60 inches of rain. We were getting about 24 inches of rain, and we looked up in August of 2011 and had less than 11 months supply of water, and our industrial base is gigantic in Jefferson County. Scared us to death. And we knew we figured we were going to need about 180,000 acre feet of water in the next 50 years. Well, that's going to be a little bit different in the next water plan. Sure. Yeah, right. We learned from trial and error to a degree. Now, remember, all the planning process regionally is made up of all the local entities. And it's the mechanism for it to go upstream. But all the local entities, Houston is responsible for Houston. Lower Neches Valley is responsible for Jefferson County, but the city of Beaumont's responsible for the city of Beaumont. But we all have to work together. And we can't ignore the information and the science, because the best science we have will give us the ability to do our best management practices, so to speak. So, but it's just not that instantaneously. I mean, you can't get it that quick and make those kind of those changes. It's got to be over a period. What happens if the drought ends tomorrow and the next thing you know we're over, which I don't believe is going to happen.
Right. Every time it rains, Chairman, people think, oh, problem solved, right?
Yeah, I don't believe it. I think we're just going through getting, the Lord is blessing us, giving us some rain. I believe we got us a longer term drought that we're in. Yeah.
I think 5-year updates is about right. When you think about how utilities do their planning, they do project planning on a 50-year horizon. So a 5-year update it's often enough to pick up on shifts in technology. A really great one that's underway right now is the use of brackish water. You're seeing the city of San Antonio turn to brackish water. By the way, El Paso gets left out of the conversation, but they've done a ton and already have a brackish desal plant. We're also seeing, and this is important in Houston, we're seeing the energy industry, in particular the fracking industry, is moving from fresh water to brackish water for its operations. That's a very important shift. It will affect future water supply projects across the board. So I think that every 5 years is about right, and I think we're seeing a lot of shifts.
But of course, to the questioner's point, I'm just thinking about the communities we've heard about that have run out of water in the last 12 to 18 months that never assumed that the problem was as dire at the time the water plan was being written.
There's not a city didn't know what was coming.
So the city of
They knew that it
So
was
the city of
coming.
Goldthwaite, I think, was
They
one that.
knew that it was
So they
coming.
knew. So that the water
Unless
plan
they had
written.
a pipe blew up yesterday.
They knew it. So,
they knew.
so at the time that the water plan was written, just to pick on Goldthwaite for a second, the assumption was it's soon. May not be now, but it's coming. And so the urgency of that is baked into the plan. So that as we look at the prioritization of projects, the communities that have now realized the worst outcomes will rise to the top simply because they've got no other choice but to be treated that way.
And let me tell you, the legislature and the state water plan can't make a local entity do anything.
Right.
And I know of no entity out there that did not know where they were as far as the amount of water they had.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean we're not going to make them go do it other than, well, that's not necessarily true either, I guess. If
Yeah.
it's public safety, that's a different issue. But
Right.
I mean, if a community decides, well, we just don't want to grow it, who are we?
Right. Last question, and I think it's Governor Hobby's. Is that right?
Bill Hobby, I work for Jim Granado.
Yes. That's technically correct.
Question to the panel. It doesn't rain enough to support a growing population in Texas. That's why we're all here. And that happens, drought happens 2 or 3 times a century.
Right.
This one is the worst one. But the fact is, if this state is going to continue to grow, we can't depend on rainfall. Isn't the ultimate answer to desalinate the Gulf of Mexico and put the water in the, what are there, 6 or 7 aquifers around the state? Desalinate that water and pump it into the aquifer. I mean, reservoirs are fine, I guess, but the reservoirs are dry, and the rivers that are feeding them
Yeah.
are running dry. So isn't putting desalinated water into the aquifers the ultimate answer? Now, that's hugely expensive.
All right, but it's available, but I think you make a good point, Governor. It's a good source. So what about that? Desalinating the Gulf of Mexico.
Desal.
Go big or go home, right?
Desal is going to be one of the answers to solving this problem. Desal out of the Gulf of Mexico does not help Dallas-Fort Worth because of cost. And when these local entities are starting to look at cost valuations, for instance, Dallas-Fort Worth, it's cheaper for them to get water out of Oklahoma than it is out of Toledo Bend. It is cheaper for Houston to get water out of San Jacinto Trinity than it is to do desal because our water is cheap. But to say that desal is not a part of the answer is crazy because it is part where it works until the market allows it to work. ASR, storage, aquifer storage. San Antonio's doing it. And actually, I got to tell you, San Antonio's done a marvelous job of keeping water for their citizens because they don't have any new water to mount the hill of beans. All of it's done through conservation measures and other measures like this. But desal will be a part of it. And Governor, you're going to see a big move on desal in the brackish aquifers right now. You're going to see a move by a lot of people that are going to want the legislature to not have any regulation of aquifers where it's brackish because they'll say, well, only we are using it. Well, that's fine and dandy. If they can go get in that aquifer and carve out exactly what they're using and that aquifer be managed. There's a lot more to that than what meets the eye, but that is part of the answer of solving this puzzle. Desal seawater, desal brackish aquifer, aquifer storage, reservoirs, but don't ever forget conservation, because in a lot of ways, it's the easiest one to apply and get done.
I could not have said that better, by the way. Don't
Is it-
forget about conservation.
Governor is asking, is that what El
Yes,
Paso is doing?
El Paso
Yeah.
has done
Yeah.
a brackish desal, and it's been a lifesaver for them. And they did they thank Kay Bailey Hutchinson every day because she helped get about 50% of the financing,
Right.
Yeah.
60% of the financing.
I'm
I
sorry.
don't
Yeah. Nuclear power?
No.
No, I don't think so.
No.
But El Paso has done more than the desal. They've also done a wonderful job on regulating outdoor watering.
Yes.
They've pulled back all their use through conservation. And there's no way for me to improve on the answer for oceanic desal except for to say it is the most expensive option available, and there's no utility or city that's going to run to the most expensive option available
Right.
because of the rate increases that would be involved.
Right.
And so the big challenge here is, you are absolutely correct. We're not wet enough to just rain our way out of this problem, but the ocean is not available enough for us just to find a clever new supply. So conservation is the most obvious first step.
Okay. All right, well, we're just past 1 o'clock, and we're committed to end here at 1. We want to thank our great panelists, Chairman Ritter and Laura Huffman of the Nature Conservancy, as well as all of you for being here. Very important conversation. Jim Granato, University of Houston, thank you very much.